Объемное действие. Taxi driver drove a taxi yesterday. Taxi driver was drawing a taxi in the morning. At that moment, taxi driver was driving a taxi at that moment. Taxi driver had already driven a taxi. Taxi driver had been driving a taxi since morning. Или taxi driver drove a taxi. Taxi driver was driving a taxi at that moment. Taxi driver have already driven a taxi. Taxi driver have been driving a taxi since morning. Вопросы. Did taxi driver drive a taxi yesterday? When did he drive a taxi? Where did he drive a taxi? What time did he drive a taxi? What kind of taxi did he drive? Why did he drive a taxi? Who drove a taxi yesterday? Was he driving a taxi at that moment? Who was driving a taxi at that moment? What was he driving at that moment? Had taxi driver driven? Had taxi driver already driven a car? What a taxi? Had the taxi driver already driven a taxi? Why had taxi driver already driven a taxi? What had taxi driver already driven? Had taxi driver been driving a car since morning? Why had taxi driver been driving a taxi since morning? Where had taxi driver been driving a taxi since morning? Вроде все.